Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pat Berger, and I'm the chair of the Mongolia Initiative here at UC Berkeley. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to this second conference held under the auspices of the Mongolia Initiative, titled Deadly Modernity, the Environmental Crisis Behind Mongolia's Swift Development. Before I get started, I want to say a few words about the Mongolia Initiative. It's funded by the Mongolian government, and it was made possible for us to found this last year under the auspices of the Institute of East Asian Studies, and we're proceeding apace with a wonderful array of programs and workshops and conferences as we move forward. As we learned in a lecture about 2 weeks ago by the art historian Esther Jacobsen-Tepfer, the environment and climate of Mongolia has been changing rather constantly. Even as early as the Pleistocene and Holocene periods, Mongolian landscape and the weather and even the faunal populations were constantly transitioning from one phase to another. So this is a change actually that Professor Jacobsen-Tepfer told us and explained to us was vividly recorded in very early rock-cut art. And we could see the transition between megafauna to more normally sized fauna over the very many millennia. So this is a fascinating thing to watch how the climate and how the environment has changed over thousands of years. And for myself as an art historian, to realize how unstable the world is and how unstable the climate and the earth itself is. The world isn't static. But the problem that we're going to be considering over the next 2 days is how modern human technology has actually accelerated environmental and climate change, specifically in Mongolia since the 1990s. So this is an issue of pressing concern and something that is one that needs to be solved. The problem has been felt already in the vast but ecologically fragile desert, steppe, and taiga regions of Mongolia, and it is one that has come about mostly because of the rapid exploitation of natural resources, which were discovered in great amounts in Mongolia after it broke away from the Soviet Union, and also have been exploited with a kind of ferocious speed over the past decades. It's also felt in cities where the air and water are suddenly not as pure and pristine as they had been in the past, and in the lives of people who are still trying to live on traditional nomadic lives. So our purpose, I think, over the next 2 days, with the presence of a long list of scholars from the United States and Mongolia, and also from other parts of the world, including Europe, is to shed light on Mongolia's environmental crisis and to consider how it has changed the way that traditional nomads live their lives, but also how urban dwellers live their lives. So this is a two-part problem in essence. What we want to do, I think, is shed light on it, but also try to describe it, to come to grips with what actually has happened, to consider its causes, and to discuss also present and future plans for how it might be responded to. So for that reason, we hope that this group of scholars and advocates, I should say, will help us see a way forward. And I wanted to thank the funders of the Mongolia Initiative. We were a little late getting started because we were waiting for the arrival of Acting Consul General Dierkes from San Francisco, but I'm guessing he's probably caught on very wet roads right now or on the Bay Bridge, so we will hope that he will arrive later. I wanted very much, in his presence actually, and I will thank him again, to thank the Mongolian government for the very generous gift that they made to the University of California at Berkeley and to the Institute of East Asian Studies, and to think about how this has really resurrected a program of study that was so lively here at Berkeley about 20 years ago and then fell by the wayside. So now we've got a revitalized program in Mongolian language and Mongolian cultural studies as well. I would also very much like to thank the staff of the Institute of East Asian Studies, and particularly Dr. Caverly Carey, who's been really so wonderful in establishing the program for this conference and in bringing everybody together and making sure that everybody's being well taken care of. Caverly's a real treasure, and we're moving forward, I think, with other plans for conferences as the days go on. And I'd also like to thank the Mongolia Initiative's advisory group, which includes Dr. Jake Dalton, who unfortunately isn't with us today because he's not feeling very well, Professor Brian Bauman, and also Frank Billet, who have been wonderful advisors as we've tried to think a way through how we might use the generous gift from the Mongolian government. And I also now want to turn to the business of the day. What we're going to do, just to outline what will happen today in the couple of hours that we have, we are going to be starting with a panel, or at least part of a panel, which will conclude tomorrow morning, and then we'll have a keynote address following that, and a brief reception afterwards, so I hope you can all stay for that. And in the absence of the acting vice consul, what I'm going to do is move directly to the panel in the hopes that he will arrive, and when the panel is finished, we can ask him to step up and say a couple of words. So the first panel includes today three speakers, and there's three speakers, and there's another speaker who will be speaking again tomorrow. Our first speaker is Oyungerel Tsvedemdamba, who is a member of parliament in Mongolia, and I love the fact that on your slide you call yourself a member of the state Great Khural of Mongolia, using the proper term. She has many other posts as well. She is the Minister of Culture, Sports, and Tourism and President of the Democratic Women's Union of Mongolia. Oyungerel served as an advisor on human rights and public participation to Mongolian President Purevdorj for the period of June 2009 through March 2010. And during her 14 years in public service, she has worked on the country's privatization efforts and social insurance reform, and served as an advisor to the Prime Minister, and now as a member of Parliament. So as you see today, she's going to be speaking to us about some impacts of current development of Mongolia on its land, water, and air. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Oyungerel.
So, first of all, I would like to thank you for gathering, for bringing many scholars on Mongolia topic, and thank Berkeley University and Mongolia Initiative and Berkeley's East Asian Studies Institute. We in Mongolia have been criticized by Western media for resource nationalism, and now we are happy to discuss resource internationalism, because when somebody brings up environmental issues, investors criticize us that we are being too nationalist about our water, air, and land. But because it's an international issue now, we're happy to discuss it, and especially why our swift and rapid development without knowledge and without proper care of our environment will bring eventually international also consequences. And of course, the first consequences will be fallen on the most poorest and helpless people. That's why I'm very grateful to be here to listen to the many discussions. And I read the brochure and the list of speakers and list of topics that we are going to discuss in these 2 days are remarkable, and I would like to listen to more of the speakers. But my speech itself is very, very general, because it's an opening also, because I'm not an academician and I'm not a researcher. So as a politician, I just touched very slightly all the basic issues. So I would like to continue on my speech, but this presentation here will show some pictures which will not be related to my current talk, because I didn't prepare to monitor it and then speak at the same time. So once in a while I will shift pictures that will not be related to the page that I will be on. So I'm sorry for that. So it is my honor to speak at this conference symposium, Deadly Modernity, the environmental crisis behind Mongolia's swift development. And thank you, the Institute of East Asian Studies, for organizing this gathering. I would like to give you an overview of the challenges of Mongolia's environment in general, These issues will be considered in detail at this conference. I'm very glad for that. And I'm pleased to see many experts in the audience who will report on the research findings, and I would happily take them to the Parliament of Mongolia. Here I would like to briefly touch the main challenges to land, air, and water in Mongolia. So land, I would like to start from the land issues. The land has been public domain ever since Mongolia had its first laws under Genghis Khan. We call him Chinggis Khan. So our land was never in private hands before 2003, when the first ever land privatization took place to give family residential land to the citizens of Mongolia only. Before that, no private person or entity owned land in Mongolia, and of course, even Chinggis Khan himself didn't own a land. Because he could not tax on land and properties on it, he instead taxed trade, therefore protecting the trade routes better than anyone in the 13th century and making the Silk Road thrive. But I would like to concentrate on the land and development of today's Mongolia. One reason why land was kept in public domain is that the land was always seen as pasture. Pasture is not always good at one particular place. Depending on climate, seasons, and occupancy or vacancy, the pasture at a certain area would be either good or not good for occupying at a given time by a given person. So it was wise to let the land remain open for anyone to occupy for a short term, while the pasture of the area was suitable for grazing. So that means that no pasture land in Mongolia is now legally registered under someone's name. It's just all unregistered land. So state and, of course, the development is taking advantage of that. Today's Constitution of Mongolia protects pasture land from privatization. It protects only from private persons, but it doesn't protect it from the state itself. So therefore, environmental problems related to land have to be solved by the government of Mongolia, first of all. So there are three main problems of land I would like to outline here. The first and, of course, most rapidly growing problem is mining, especially strip mining of coal. So strip mining of coal is a dominant land user among all other mining activities. Lands licensed to coal and oil exploration and extraction in South Gobi province alone now comprise 20% of its territory, therefore reducing the pasture in the area and causing overgrazing in the remaining pasture in the Gobi. If the world continues to turn away from coal and the commodity market will be even lower, commodity market price for coal will be even lower, then more than 2/3 of this licensed land might remain intact and Gobi pasture lands might be preserved. The current low price on coal is giving us a little bit of chance to breathe and talk seriously about the costs of our mineral extraction policies and prompting us to more quickly diversify of our economy. The second biggest issue on land is overgrazing. So overgrazing is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Because of overgrazing, our grasslands are losing their biodiversity. No flowers, no seeds, because all animals just eat it like a machine, you know. And then, and the grasses that grow from the seeds are disappearing, while the grasses that can grow from spreading its roots are doing somewhat better. But overgrazing and low rainfall mean grasses do not have enough growth in the summer, and they are of lesser and lesser height and density in the following seasons. These traits are rendering our pastures increasingly vulnerable for desertification. And desertification is reaching to the northernmost area of Mongolia. There is a pressing need for a law on pasture. But because pasture is constitutionally protected by state, the state doesn't want to give pasture to anyone, doesn't want to record pasture land on anyone's name. So because of that political protection, pasture law on pasture was never been passed, and it was always been delayed from parliament to another parliament. So now, nomadic herders are, because nomadic herders has been and still now are the highest turnout voters. Nobody wants to touch the issues that touch the nomadic herders. So this is another election year, but this is again another pressing year to talk about pasture law, but at the same time, who will come out to vote? The highest number is nomadic herders, so that's why our grazing is remaining from election to election. So third biggest challenge is climate change. So climate change is altering the land and its uses. Lack of rain or extra strong windstorms, wildfires, and excessively high temperatures during the grass growing seasons are degrading our pasture land. And Mongolia's climate is changing twice as fast as the world average, but researchers will give even more precise number for that, I'm sure. At the same time, Mongolia is contributing to the climate change. We don't harvest methane gas from enormous coal mining sites. So we have enormous coal mines which constantly produce methane gas, but nobody is harvesting from it. Tavan Tolga coal mine, for example, has it, but its methane gas is just leaking out of the dig sites and into the atmosphere directly. We burn coal in every town. In order to help reduce climate change, Mongolia has to stop giving new exploration licenses for coal mining, at least at the beginning, and reduce the use of coal in our settled areas. So that's, we are trying to start talking about it. Why I'm not saying doing, because nobody's doing yet, but we're just beginning to start talking about reducing coal and not doing coal-based heating, and we're trying to figure out how to do it. All these talks are starting only thanks to Paris Agreement. The second part of my talk, I would like to concentrate on air. As Mongolia's average elevation is a mile high, there is a smaller amount of oxygen in the air as compared to the sea level. Unfortunately, half of our population is breathing even lower amount of oxygen and much more unpleasant and dangerous particles and chemicals into our lungs. The worst air pollution is in Ulaanbaatar. However, all cities and towns of Mongolia experience the similar kinds of air pollution, but in differing amounts. The main pollutants of our airs, of course, number one is coal. Coal burning in Gerd districts of Ulaanbaatar is producing 80% of the air pollution of the city. The average height of pipe of a family's stove is 3 to 4 meters. During wintertime, when family members gets up and light fresh new fire, I would like to show you this picture actually. Okay, this. When they get up and children inhale the thickest dirty smoke and particulate matter in their home gears and on their way to school. Second biggest pollutant of the air is again coal. Coal burning in the 2 power plants of Ulaanbaatar and 3 dozens of decentralized furnaces don't have enough air pollution control on the exhausts and smoke stacks. Ulaanbaatar's coal plants pollute not only the city area, but also around 100 kilometers circle around the capital city. Wildlife protected areas like Hosta, many of you know Hosta. Hosta have air pollution from Ulaanbaatar's power plants. The third big pollutant is cars, buses, and trucks. This air pollution produced by oil. So far, there are no air pollution control mechanisms on vehicles. Only once a year, the vehicles go through a technical test where they have to meet certain standards of air pollution control once a year. And that's usually in summer. So, fourth biggest main fourth pollutant of the air is particulate matters from coal burning, furnaces, and other burnings. And the fifth is indoor smoking in irregulated areas. Until recently, indoor smoking was everywhere. If you've been to Mongolia after 2013, you probably got surprised why all those indoor smoking disappeared, because all restaurants, all public places now have smoking ban, and we stopped smoking in public areas very successfully. But there are many irregulated areas, especially homes. So, however, enforcement in some universities and schools is still poor. The general enforcement of this smoking ban is very successful. But the major threat to children's health is remaining their homes. Their home is becoming the biggest indoor pollution area. They imagine children living in that outdoor smoke is like this, indoor smoke is dad smoking, and street is like this when they go to school. So this is the biggest health hazards that children of Ulaanbaatar is now facing. The Mongolian government took measures to reduce air pollution, and many donors' dollars have been spent for this purpose over the past few years. However, there has been no significant change in pollution indices like happened when Mongolia stopped indoor smoking in public venues. It is because every investment to reduce air pollution was spent on reducing the use of coal, but not excluding coal from winter heating alternatives. So as coal is cheaper and cheaper, the winter of 2015 and 2016 is well on the way to becoming the highest polluting winter in the last 5 years, despite all the efforts directed at replacing old stoves with coal-efficient ones. Therefore, the solution with coal proves elusive. And the Mongolian government is now actively working on a new plan to eliminate air pollution in GER districts especially, that heating should be based on non-coal systems. In parallel to changing the heating systems in GER districts, strict rules are to be applied to air pollution control from power plants, factories, motor vehicles that will hopefully come with the new law on waste management, which is being prepared for the debate in the parliamentary spring session. Quickly, in my remaining 3 minutes, I quickly would like to touch water. So I would like to use our common geographic Mongolian landscape in terms of water. In Mongolia, we use 3 terms of landscape: gobi, hangai, and steppe. So these terms depict the environmental and ecological differences between the landscape. Those who visited Mongolia can vividly imagine the differences between gobi, hangai, and the steppe. But for those who have never been to Mongolia, I would like to say that gobi is like Arizona and New Mexico, and hangai is like Colorado and Montana, and our steppe is like Kansas and Nebraska. So of course, the new landscape of this century is also city. So I will touch upon the city water situation too. When we talk about water in the Gobi, we are talking about rare open water sources like oases, ponds, like these ones. So Gobi open water usually comes out of nearby mountains. As the mountains snow melt, it rushes down slope. The water carrying slope look dry for the most of the year, and the water collected at the bottom of the mountain remains as oases to water livestock, wildlife, and humans. The number one threat to Gobi water is the strip mining of coal that covers wide areas. When mining tears up the mountain areas that surround the oases dry up and the mountain slope stops supplying water. Another threat to Gobi's open water is climate change and lack of rain and snow. So the third challenge to Gobi water is drying out of wells. The Hanga water challenges are a little different from Gobi's. The Hanga region has the majority of Mongolia's rivers and lakes. Their number one challenge is gold mining that exposes minerals from undergrounds, and multiple minerals oxidizes in water, thus changing the water chemistry. When the Orkhon River that runs through most of the Hanga provinces turned red-brown in 2009, a movement to save Mongolia's rivers held a sit-in demonstration demanding a law on protection of the rivers, watersheds, and lakes. In response, a protective watershed and rivers was passed. The issuing of mining licenses was halted for 5 years. Unfortunately, it revived again in 2015. So moratorium that lasted until 2015 commenced in 2010. During this period, Mongolia was widely criticized by Western financial media that our policy was too much resource nationalist. There is a constant tension between mining projects in water areas and the environmental watchdogs. One of the highest tensions is related to half of the territory of Hupskul province, where 90% of Mongolia's water originates. Since 1988, Hupskul province activists and key media leaders have been opposing all attempts to launch phosphate mining. Therefore, for the past 30 years, each time phosphate mining talks start at the government level, media and environmental watchdogs fight back to stop the plan. Other challenges to Hanga water are industrial waste from the leather, meat, and other factories, farming runoff, and lack of restoration of old mines and pollution from organic waste from herd animals. So I would like to abbreviate my talk because I was warned that my time is running out. But I would like to say just a few words about Ulaanbaatar's water. So Ulaanbaatar's water has two big challenges. Of course, one is a big industrial water coming to the sewage and killing all the bio-cleaning organisms. And the second biggest challenge in Ulaanbaatar's water is pit toilets in every family's yard. There are 180,000 families who have simple pit toilets. Pollutants directly go to the groundwater. So that's we're trying to change now. State budget allocated money for sludge and pit toilet improvements for the first time this year with my big advocacy, and I, as a sponsor of waste management law, I'm advocating to change everybody's toilet. And I think I would like to have many numbers from this conference so that my advocacy can also bring more Tugriks to changing everybody's pit toilets. And that is very, very big challenge for Ulaanbaatar's groundwater, because Ulaanbaatar is dependent on groundwater. At the same time, Ulaanbaatar is most polluted groundwater because of our poor sanitation. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly interesting talk and a wonderful introduction, I think, to the problems that we're going to be discussing for the rest of today and tomorrow. Our second speaker is Alicia Campi from the Jamestown Foundation. I think anybody who knows anything about Mongolian studies has heard the name of Alicia Campi. She is currently the president of the Mongolia Society, which is the largest group concerned with Mongolian studies in the United States, and also of the Chinggis Khan Foundation, which promotes Mongolian educational, cultural, and environmental activities in Mongolia and the United States. She's one of the few people, I think, in the United States who actually holds a PhD in Mongolian studies from Indiana University, which of course is a great center for that enterprise here. She spent many years working on issues related to Mongolian studies and the U.S.-Mongolian bilateral relationship. She's worked as an advisor to the U.S. State Department, including negotiating, and this is extremely interesting, negotiating the establishment of the Peace Corps program in Mongolia in 1991, and has worked for various organizations that focused on Northeast Asia. So please join me in welcoming Alicia Campi.
I have to close that down, sorry. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here for my first time at Berkeley at this wonderful conference, and I certainly applaud the Berkeley program, and I'm very grateful that the Mongolian government has generously sponsored programs involving Mongolia now at Berkeley, because Berkeley during the Cold War era was a center of studies on Mongolia led by Dr. Robert Scalapino, who I am old enough to have known. My remarks today are trying to place the environmental movement within, shall we say, the political reality of Mongolian domestic and international relations, so that as we go forward for 2 days and look at the individual problems and issues that need to be worked upon, and we, of course, are people of goodwill who want to help Mongolia, that we have to realize that there's a context here, and so that the Mongolian policymakers and the Mongolian people have many difficult situations to balance as they go forward with their development, and at the same time try to preserve their nature and their very interesting way of life. Now, Mongolian environmental issues impact and are impacted by the intersection of domestic politics and the proactive policies in the last 20 years of all Mongol administrations, regardless of party, to attract foreign direct investment, FDI, create globalization development strategies and Northeast Asia regional integration plans, and respond to national security issues. One cannot discuss specific Mongolian environmental problems and potential solutions without understanding the domestic political context, concrete plans to diversify the economy away from resource minerals, and Mongolian greater goals to raise the country's profile in Eurasia. And we got some of this mentioned by parliamentarian Oyengerel's speech when she talked about specific problems and then how the election or the parliament was dealing with these things. Now, Western and Chinese investors in Mongolia's mining sector usually have not taken these larger issues, as well as domestic parliamentary politics and local environmental movements among the countryside nomadic population, into their calculations when pressing Mongolian policymakers to develop mining policies favorable to foreign investors and enforce environmental regulations via a transparent and equitable legal system. In the last decade, so on one side you have the mining investors, foreigners, Western companies, including their governments. And on the other side, in the last decade, we've had foreign-based or foreign-funded environmental local NGOs that have had both positive and negative influences on Mongolian politicians and the local population. They have galvanized Mongolian citizens in Ulaanbaatar and at the local level to not only become engaged about environmental issues, but organize themselves to be proactive in educating the public and government leaders about specific concerns. However, at times, these NGOs have promoted environmental policies at variance with fundamental Mongolian concerns regarding economic, social, and national security issues. And such disconnects have intensified social fissures and led to inefficient use of financial resources. As Mongolia goes into parliamentary elections this June, environmental issues, particularly connected to mining and energy development and intensification, will once again rise to play a meaningful role in local elections. So it's appropriate to take a closer look at the impact of environmental issues on Mongolian domestic politics and foreign economic policy making. Now, Mongolia distinguishes itself from other countries in its region and even in the whole world because it has strong links to its traditional nomadic heritage, so different from the sedentary big agricultural societies that dominate the Asian region. Many inside and outside Mongolia are firmly committed to preserving and extending the country's pristine natural habitat, where transhuman culture and nomadic economic tradition continue as they have done for centuries. But here is one of the modern dilemmas. There are millions more herded animals, we heard about overgrazing, on the Mongolian plateau than ever in Mongolian history, and their animal type and their pasturing system are not the same as centuries ago. Now, if people were to read Owen Lattimore's superb narratives in the 1920s, such as Inner Asian Frontiers of China, they would understand that the nomadic lifestyle over the millennia in this Eurasian region is a constantly evolving one. In other words, it didn't look like what it looks like today, or looked like 50 years ago under the socialist era. But it is like all lifestyles and economies, it does not exist in a vacuum. Rather, it is dependent upon and a supplier of sedentary economies that surround it. So this then is the situation facing today's Mongolian nomads and the rest of their countrymen as they attempt to preserve but modernize and adapt themselves and their nation to the globalized world. Today, as in the past, they live in a difficult region, climatically, geographically, and politically. Mongolia is totally landlocked with two powerful neighbors that for centuries have been involved in Mongolian internal affairs and economics, and who believe they still must maintain special rights and connections to Mongolia in order to ensure their own national security and economic development, as well as to manage peace in the entire North Asian region. The Mongolian people and government may not like the policies of their border neighbors, China and Russia. However, they cannot ignore away this situation, but must manage it in the most efficacious way possible. We outsiders who love Mongolia and want to help preserve its environment and insist in developing an advanced, yes, equitable and just society also must factor in this reality. During the last 25 years of democracy and the building of a free market economy, Mongolian policymakers have faced the dilemma of development and poverty alleviation. Although Mongolia's economic growth has helped to reduce poverty by more than 11% in recent years, there is also rising income inequality. Poverty is much higher in the rural areas, 35%, compared to the urban areas, 23%, as herders in the countryside struggle to survive as their traditional livelihood dissolves. Mongolia at the end of the socialist era, I was in Mongolia in 1975 and again in 1990, so I know what I'm talking about here. At that period, in the socialist era, there were three distinct sectors of the Mongolian economy. One, industrial and mining, with the main national income source being the giant copper mine at Erdenet. 2, collectivized agriculture, which included animal husbandry. 3, tourism. Yet, during that period, the Soviets had to subsidize about 1/3 of Mongolia's budget. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the same 3 major sectors are still promoted as the most important economic drivers of the Mongolian economy. State-owned industries may have collapsed and the proportion of private mining operations funded or partially funded by FDI greatly expanded, but still mining revenues and taxes provide the largest income to the state budget that continues to operate with great shortfalls, which are sustained now by assuming large amounts of debt from foreign lenders. The privatization of the herding economy and the dismantling of cereal crop and vegetable collectives early in the 1990s led to an explosion of animals on the land and the return of people to the countryside. While this has been welcomed as a rational return to the Mongolian traditional way to utilize the harsh steppe environment, the meat, animal byproduct, and animal hair processing industries that should emerge from such an economy have not developed in such a way as to maximize profits and greatly increase export trade. Meanwhile, the tourist sector has grown significantly from 12,000 visitors in 1990 to over 400,000 in 2014. Nevertheless, this sector only represents about 2 to 3% of the nation's GDP. Why? Because the tourist industry's development is blocked by lack of hotel and gear camp facilities, poor domestic transport infrastructure, and a shortage of passenger, air, and train capacity. While a new international airport will be fully functional by 2017, domestic air travel is not being exploited, and the national road network simply does not reach many places. In such a situation, to call for Mongolia to diversify its economy and rebalance away from the profitable but more environmentally damaging mining sector, which alone can fund the domestic infrastructure, finance better health and social welfare systems, and pay down these huge foreign loans, is simply not reasonable. Furthermore, Mongolia's 2 giant neighbors and other countries in the Eurasian region are interested in greater transport and pipeline connectivity to promote integration and development. For Mongolia to stand outside this trend, rather than be a part of the decision-making structure, is not only dooming the Mongols to marginalization and poverty, but in reality almost impossible from a foreign relations point of view. Environmentalists talk about alternative energy production and reducing pollution from mining and using coal. But today in Mongolian government offices, you see it in the media, there are comprehensive new measures being taken to increase Mongolia's coal export and to reduce the customs clearance fees and royalty fees for coal sold on foreign markets. Such steps are being taken in order to increase government revenue based on tax and payments and to increase jobs in the coal deposits and service sector. Now, I'm not going to go into all the explanation I have about the different sectors that I looked at when we are talking about environment versus development. One of them is the transferred infrastructure. We have to recognize that before Mongolia can truly develop its economy, including large-scale mining, it must face the challenge of upgrading its poor domestic transit infrastructure. And in fact, someone once said, Mongolian exports are just as landlocked as Mongolia itself. The country doesn't have access to ports, so it must be integrated into Northeast Asian, Eurasian rail, road, and pipe systems. And because it doesn't have infrastructure, its coal is not competitive compared to other exports due to the high transport costs. Now, because of the upcoming parliamentary election, it's not expected that any major decisions on new rail infrastructure will be made until a new cabinet is formed in the autumn of 2016. This means that even in the best case scenario, a new railway is unlikely to be commissioned before 2019, which is why some coal producers are pessimistic on the development of the Tavan-Tolgoi railway project and other infrastructure projects in Mongolia in the medium term. Now, let's then turn to how do we actually mine in Mongolia, what is called responsible mining. Now, there are many in the world who do not believe there is such a thing as responsible mining. Yet mining is the backbone of Mongolia's economy and has been so since the 1960s. In the last decade, Mongolia enjoyed rapid economic growth fueled by large mining investments. And over the past few years, falling commodity prices, conflicts with local communities, cost overruns, non-transparent legal environment, and vacillating foreign investment laws have squeezed FDI. And as parliamentarian Oyun Gerel said, Mongolia, by changing its legal environment about mineral investment and overall FDI, was severely criticized by the United States government and many Western governments. But, okay, what happened then? Actually, the nomads in the countryside who were nomadizing didn't suffer as much as other segments of the Mongolian economy, because they were relying on meat or cashmere for their income. But people in urban areas, rural communities surrounding the large mining deposits, and private enterprises that support the mining industry suffered substantial loss of income. And this is one reason why we had rises in unemployment in Ulaanbaatar. The country and the economy are struggling with two big environmental issues: preventing water pollution, which is especially in the north and the center of the country, which is often caused by gold mining practices by Mongols and Chinese who use mercury and cyanide. The problem is key to Ulaanbaatar residents because they're the ones who could be poisoned. And they also have in Ulaanbaatar extreme air pollution and sewage sludge. And the new sewage sludge field, which has odors emanating from it that spread 14 kilometers from its site through Ulaanbaatar, is pledged to be cleaned up by June, in time for the new election. The second major pollution issue is in a different part of the country, and that's what to do in the South Gobi with the limited water supply where livestock herders need it, and so do the country's biggest mines. So we have a countryside problem, and we also have a city problem. They both involve water resources, but impact different sectors of society and the voting public. So what happens with mining revenues? Well, I don't have the time to talk about how in the 2009 election, political parties used these revenues, which were in the Human Development Fund, to distribute mining wealth in what were called cash handouts to every Mongolian citizen. Although they were just $14 per person per month, people thought that they were an attempt to buy votes. And also, in the end, the new government couldn't pay them anymore because there was tremendous shortfall in the budget. However, families, especially in the countryside, had gotten used to these cash handouts. And so when they were withdrawn, then they went to the local governments and asked for social benefits. Now, there's an interesting study done by the Development Policy Center at Australian National University about Mongolia's experience with resources to cash transfers, because it may have been the only country in the world that ever did this. Although it had short-term benefits, it found, basically because the program was not efficient, the money was wasteful and unaffordable, and the public turned against it. Then, of course, there's the Oyo Togoi legacy. You can't talk about mining and how people feel about it if we don't talk about Oyo Togoi. I always say that the non-transparent and corrupt legacy of Oyo Togoi is a gift that never stops giving and haunts the development of this huge copper-gold deposit. And the story of how it originally, with covert assistance from the Russian, American, and Mongolian governments, this big deposit was handed over to Ivanhoe, is not very clearly revealed, even today, but it is the source of the bad terms of the original OT contract, which has generated now more than a decade of mistrust and step-by-step turned the Mongolian citizenry against large Western mining ventures. And then we have further corruption in recent times, which now are supposedly changed and settled because we have a new agreement for the second phase of Oyo Togoi to be implemented, which the present government says will soon be able to transfer the needed funds into the state budget. Whether this is a reality or just another economic dream, which after the election will make the Mongolian people even more bitter and unhappy about the Oyo Togoi situation, can be debated. Then there are specific environmental issues, which Rio Tinto, which has taken over Oyo Togoi, has been involved in, where you have herders competing against what Oyo Togoi management feels are their stringent measures or remediation measures. When you add the fact that we have Mongolian local activists, one who's very famous, Mr. Munkbayer, who in his advocacy, on the one hand, is given an award by the American government, an American organization, not the government, for his environmental activism, and then 2 years later is arrested as an eco-terrorist for attacking the parliament building. This doesn't help the organized environmental movement. Now, I do not have time to go into the details about how new electric power and projects are being drawn up with the Russian and the Chinese governments in order to formulate plans to increase electric production in Mongolia and in the region. If you don't use the coal and you go to you use water resources, then we have problems, and we have a dispute now on the Egg River, which involves President Putin and with some Mongolian officials who have stated that they feel that Russia is trying to bully the Mongols into not using their own water resources. I just want to conclude now to talk about how mining is a reality in Mongolia because it contributes 1/3 of the GDP and accounts for almost 90% of the exports. We do all realize, if you've looked at the Oyo Togoi agreement, that the issue is far from settled. Resource nationalism will certainly be a topic in the run-up to the parliamentary elections with the opposition party, the Mongolian People's Party. And many foreign investors and governments believe that if they win the election, that we again will have a more hostile situation for foreign investment. But if you have a more hostile situation, then who's going to pay the loans? Millions, billions of dollars of loans are coming due in 2017 and 2018 that Mongolia must begin to pay back. Who is going to put in the new infrastructure in the roads and the rails and the power plants, which will improve the living standard of the Mongolians, whether they're in the countryside or the city? This is the problem. But at the same time, we also must remember that Mongolia itself, every time we have an election, almost always changes the party in control. They many times void contractual agreements advance their own policies, replace personnel. So with such a turnover, to make any long-term planning in any section of the economy or the nation becomes almost impossible. Mongolia has a great need for national transport networks. And many of the present plans involve a great deal of financial support from international organizations such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. They're the ones who are going to fund the new coal plants and the new hydroelectric plants, but they're also the same organizations in other offices criticizing Mongolia's pollution and environmental policies. So this is the situation that Mongolia and Mongolian policymakers and the public really face, and this is the kind of thing that they're going to have to consider when they vote in June and will have to make some hard choices about their country's future and the role mining will play in its environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Campi. That was really, really interesting. Our third speaker in this panel for today is Dr. Clyde Goulden, a pioneering ecologist and director of the Asia Center of the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel University and of the Institute for Mongolian Biodiversity and Ecological Studies, also at Drexel. He first visited Mongolia in 1994, shortly after it emerged from the international isolation of 70 years of rule by the former Soviet Union. And since then, he has devoted his life to studying the alarming rate of climate change and how it's affecting the country's herders and one of the most pristine lakes in the world, the 2-million-year-old lake Hessl. His efforts haven't gone unnoticed. I wanted to specifically let you know that he has won a very high award in Mongolia, the Order of the Polar Star. And this is only given to people who have proven themselves to be the greatest friends of Mongolia. Previous recipients include former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Senator John McCain. But I might also add, and this has great relevance for Berkeley, our own Professor James Bosson. So let's welcome Dr. Clyde Goulden.
Literally, I start with rain. Sorry about that, but let me explain very briefly. We set up a series of interviews with Mongolian herders in the northern part of the country. And, you know, as an ecologist, I thought, of course, that the heat associated with global warming was going to have a big impact. But we got to a point where most of the herders just wanted to talk about the rains. And that's why I'm going to talk about the rains. Little justification for what I'm saying. If you can see right in this area right here, there's a rainstorm you don't want to be caught in if you can avoid it. And I'll tell you more about that as we go along here then. That's a rain that for those of you who are familiar with rain intensity, that could be, though we didn't measure that because it was running ahead of us as we drove south, would have been somewhere around 20 to 40 millimeters per hour. And we used to think of a 40 or 50 millimeter rain per day as being a really heavy rain. Times are changing. The areas that we've been working in, I mentioned northern Mongolia, obviously, or Lake Huzgal, which many of you are familiar with, and also over in Hentiaimag. Just to give you a little idea of what these valleys are like, of course, it's all mountain in there, the Henti Mountains, the Sayans, the Altai Sayans. The valleys themselves where the herders primarily live, at least during the summer months, consist on their south-facing slopes, number one there, of a very dry steppe. Of course, it's semi-arid to begin with, so you're not going to have very much moisture on the ground unless there's some way to sort of hold the moisture in place in the soil. And when you go over to the riparian zone where the stream is, and on the north-facing slope, there's permafrost. Mongolia has some of the southernmost permafrost throughout all of Asia. It's thawing, obviously, but it's very important, in fact, to retaining moisture in that area. So the herders now are primarily, during the summer, grazing on those south-facing slopes in the valleys. They get their water, of course, from the streams, from ponds, from rainwater. During the winter grazing, they move up into the ridges, the ridge tops, the mountain tops, and they're very dependent on the previous summer's grasses, and they're also using the water from the ice and snow in that region. Now more and more we are finding that more of the herders are going to otter. Some of you may be familiar with that, where the herders simply move, I don't want to say at random because they really know where they're going, of course, but they're moving across the countryside. They're not restricting themselves to particular areas where they have traditional grazing lands. And that's been essential, in fact, for them to be able to get enough of the grass that they need for their animals. This is a group of a family of herders coming from the mountains in the springtime. They're coming down to Lake Huvsgol in this particular case, and you can see the yaks carrying all of their belongings, the animals coming down behind. And then throughout the summer, they'll be grazing on these south-facing slopes. And of course, there's a combination there, in this particular case, of sheep and the Kashmir goats. So if you look at the top here, what you see is for Mongolia in general, and this is a study by Purevdorj, who was formerly with the ministry and also been associated with the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, did a very extensive study of climate warming in Mongolia. And the average warming for Mongolia is certainly it's warming twice as fast as the United States. So you're talking about a very rapid warming, over 2 degrees. In fact, that was as of 2005. A similar comprehensive study hasn't been done since then, but it's clearly warming very rapidly. Now, it may not sound like very much for over a 65-year period, but this is a very dramatic change for that area. So the things that we were most concerned about in interviewing the herders was to learn more of their perspective of the changes that were going on with the climate change. Here, we're warming 1 degree Celsius at most. They're way ahead of us in terms of warming. And the reason when I'm asked, why do you want to go to Mongolia to study climate change? We can do that here. Well, that's a good laboratory to go study, as you can appreciate. Because what is happening there could well be occurring here in the future. And we need to understand that. So that's the reason for the focus. So we decided to set up a series of interviews with herders in Huvsgol Imag and in Hente Imag. And the kinds of questions we were really asking, initially we had two series of interviews, but the first set of interviews were just an open-ended kind of discussion with the herders. We simply said, is your environment changing? And they would say a few words. And then they'd say, is it getting warmer? And they'd say, oh yeah, the sun burns the grass, and things like that would go on like that. And then you would say, is the rain changing? And instead of a 5-minute discussion, you'd get into a discussion that could go on for 1 hour or 2 hours at times, and they would go in great detail of how the rain changes were affecting them. And these rain changes that I'm going to show you more about are starting to have big effects not only on the pastures, but also on the animals, and even sometimes on the herders themselves when they're out managing their herds. So these are the kinds of questions that we were focused on. Again, we had 2 sets of interviews. The first one was an open-ended series, and the second one was a more specific with individual questions to follow up on the results from the initial set of interviews. We actually in total interviewed well over 100 individuals during these interviews, and it was just a simple, very relaxed kind of situation where you would be in this particular case, it's a log cabin in the northern part of the country, but it would be the same thing with the ger. And you'd have milk, tea, hard yogurt, cheese to sit there and munch on. Monterey is doing all of the translation. This is Nemocher, former ranger at Hoove's National Park. And these people really have lead very interesting lives from my perspective and very interesting observations. So you ask a question, have the seasons changed? Yes, but no consistent trend. Have the rains changed? And then they go in this great detail. The rains have changed. 98% of the herders we interviewed said the rains have changed. The rains used to be light and last several hours to a few days. Rains used to wet the soil. Now rains are much more intense, and these percentages are the results of these open-ended questions, so that you didn't ask them specifically, are the rains more intense? They volunteered this. Rains are colder, increased gusty winds during rains. Summer rains start later, lower value. People were somewhat hesitant on that. One of the really key issues on this was they said the rains are not wetting the soil, and that more of the water runs off of the land and causes flooding. Before moving to the next slide, just want to tell you a little bit about the rains themselves. Mongolians have several names, of course, for rains. We're only focused on 3 different types of rains that became the most common in their description. Chevrolet rains were light rains like you would have outside today, assuming that it's only going to last for 2 or 3 hours. But if it goes on for 1 or 2 or 3 days, it's a Zusa rain. And then you have these otter rains that are very intense. The kind of rain that I showed you a picture of, but that's a really strong otter rain. But nevertheless, it's one of these very, very intense, what we would call torrential rain, raining cats and dogs, whatever way you want to call it. We don't have a name for it except that it's a downpour. The Mongolians are, in my mind, superb because this acts as a way for them to remember what has happened in the past. They really tie, they think, you ask them, like that one rain I showed you a few minutes ago. We got to the town down there, and I said to the herder, did it rain? And he said, oh yeah, it was really bad. It was a really bad otter rain. And that's the way he remembers it. He didn't say this is a Chevrolet rain. In fact, when they talk about these lighter rains, they don't remember specifically when those happen in terms of their frequency, but they do remember these very intense otter rains that they're talking about now more and more. So we wanted to follow up in terms of really trying to key in on what the herders' perceptions were. And so we pulled out a lot of the meteorological data that was available from the weather stations throughout the northern part of Mongolia. And we did a data analysis on those to see if we could get information on these really heavy rains that the herders were talking about. Most of the data, when it's available to people like ourselves, are basically daily values. For rainfall, then, it's for the whole day. It's hard to get anything that's less than that. And we use some software that was developed by the World Meteorological Organization called Climedex, in the R version of Climedex, that's used for detecting extremes and trends in rainfall. We also had a set of our own data, however, from calibrated meteorological stations that were recording at 5-minute intervals. Let me first focus on these daily values, though. We then ran a series of tests to find out what was going on with the daily data. And basically what we, oops, sorry, jumped ahead there. Basically what we found was that there were, in looking at temperature changes, there were a number of changes that could be detected using the Climedex software. We looked at rain changes that would tell us whether the rains really had increased in intensity, were they longer, were they harder, whatever, total rains. And there were no significant changes that we could find in the data analysis. So just looking now at what the herders are saying throughout on this, to give you an idea. So these are quotations that we'll go through very quickly. The otter rain in September eroded the road. Very intense, very dangerous. The Gare was flooded, mattresses were floating, pasture was covered with running water. Intense heavy rain pours within 5 minutes and causes flooding. Otterboro, the heavy rain, was experienced frequently, especially previous summer. I'm always scared of that kind of rain. These are individual herders telling us. So in 2009, following up on that, we did the second set of interviews, and we asked the herders then to rank, based on their own experience, how they would rank the rains in terms of the chevre, the light rains, the Zusa rains, the otter rains, from the time period when they were children or when they were younger, and how that would contrast with today's rains. And it turned out very, very significant, as you can see there with these p-values, that the otter rains were perceived as more common now than in the past, and the chevre Zusa rains were seen as less common now. So just a few more quotes on this. When we were kids, we had gentle, warm, shivery rains lasting 2 to 3 days, and we could go out barefoot without shirts and play in the rain. Now it is too cold, and the kids do not like to go out in the rain. And basically what we're seeing here, and this has been reported elsewhere, we're basically seeing a transition from a stratiform kind of rain, a rain where the clouds are probably around 6,000 to 7,000 feet, maybe 10,000 feet, and the rains are coming in as a broad front. This is at a low altitude, so the rain is still fairly warm. This is in contrast with the otter rains, which are actually convective type storms. And whether they, when they're coming in, they're actually very patchy when they're coming in, but the clouds where that rain precipitation is originating is up around 30, 40, or 50,000 feet. So you're really talking about moisture that has been taken up through a warm convective system, and then when it cools down very dramatically, and then it starts falling, and when these little droplets are starting to form, they start coalescing, and they're making larger and larger raindrops. And so when they come down, they're coming down at a pretty terrific speed. And that's why they're doing so much damage. Skip over some of these other things. So you talk about some of the other things that the herders are saying. The grass is not growing well. Pasture quality is degrading. Winter hay collection is more difficult. They're very dependent upon winter hay. They collect what they call hadlin, the name for, of course, that type of fodder. They have to spend more time and collect in a larger area to be able to get sufficient winter hay to feed their animals. You ask them what their greatest impact is. Overgrazing is important. They talk about it a lot, but much more they talk about weather and the changing climate. So with the, as I mentioned before, the temperature changes were also significant, as one would expect, but the precipitation changes, none of them was significant. So then the question you have, they've been telling you that it's really bad, the rains are really torrential rains, and they're really damaging to them, to their animals, to the pasture, and yet you look at the data and you can't find anything. So what's going on here? And that was a little bit frustrating at first, to say the least. And we just happen to have, as I mentioned earlier, some 5-minute data, a meteorological station that was recording at 5-minute periods. And so we had a huge amount of data, to say the least. We looked through that very carefully, and what we discovered, if you look at the horizontal line right here, that's the threshold for auto rains. Anything above that horizontal line is an auto rain. And it will have lasted, again, recording at 5-minute periods. This rain, for example, this 5-minute auto rain, that is the initial few minutes, actually lasted for 40 minutes. Another one lasted 25 minutes. Sometimes they're short, 10 minutes, 35 minutes. These are particularly bad. And what I want to show you, in fact, I'm going to just skip over a couple of these things. Let me first tell you why these rains are changing this way. I mentioned already you have a transition going from stratiform rains to convective storms, basically. And you might as well call them thunderstorms, because that's what they really are, except that they're very, very intense thunderstorms. What happens is that with the warming, you can add, in terms of water vapor, the evaporation of moisture from soil. As temperature increases, that increases, and it goes up at a rate of about 6.8 or 7% more water vapor per 1 degree Celsius change in temperature. Now, this is not an additive, this is an exponential increase. So you could say, well, it went up 7%, we went up 1 degree. Now we've gone up 2 degrees, well, it went more than 14% increase because of that exponential relationship. At the same time, those storms then, with the warming that's occurring, the air masses are getting warmer, they're rising much higher, and that's why you get the convective storm effect. And what also is happening is that as that rain gets up to a high enough temperature that it's now will start condensing, it's releasing all of the heat that energy it had absorbed to evaporate in the first place. It's called latent heat. And that, in fact, drives the whole storm even higher up in altitude. So with more moisture, higher altitude, it's rather unfortunate aspect of what's going on there in Mongolia. And you can see these kinds of storms. We just happened to see this one as we were driving back to Ulaanbaatar from Henti Aimag. This isn't really a heavy rain while we're looking over a mountainside there, so you don't really get to see very much. But then you get to this storm right here. And again, as I said, this is not the kind of storm that you want to walk through. And the only reason we know it was an otter storm, at least based on what the herders are saying, the local people we talked with in the town that we got to down there said that it was an otter rain. And you could tell there was water all over the streets. The herders have said, again, that a transition has occurred from these light rains to the heavy rains. You look at changes in thunderstorm activity. Unfortunately, some of the Hatgal values up there are a bit off, but these three lines right here for Ulaanbaatar, Onderhan, and Morin are all very significant increases, showing that the number of thunderstorms in Mongolia has increased significantly. So then we asked the herders, of course, what can they do about this? Of course, and they combined it with the warming also. They said right away they felt they had to move more often. Several of them, at least 20% of them, said that. 30% said they had to reduce the size of the herds by culling the weak animals, to reduce grazing impacts and adopt sustainable practices, or reduce cashmere goats, even though we all like cashmere, and it's a cash crop. But goats eat the entire plant, and they pull it up. I've seen them eat it just like you would a cob of corn. You know, you start on one end, and they just sort of go right through that plant. Some of them, and unfortunately, too many of them, besides collecting more hay, which is really a big issue, but many of them say that they're going to give up herding and move to the city. So these are the climate casualties, or in the future will be the climate casualties that we're all talking about. And then finally, you always have this kind of a response. I'm not well prepared. What can you do with the weather? It's beyond our control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Goulden. I think we had an otter rain that prevented from acting Council Really? It might be different out there now. But acting Consul General Purevdorj was held up by a traffic jam caused by whatever kind of rain we're having out there right now, which is typical in the Bay Area. One drop falls on the Bay Bridge and everybody comes to a halt, even if we've been raining for several weeks. So I wanted very much to invite him to step up to the podium and give us some remarks. We were thanking the Mongolian government earlier again for its very generous funding of the Mongolia Initiative, which of course is what's making this conference possible. And we thank you very much for your continuing support. So let's welcome Acting Consul General Purevdorj.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for delay. I was delayed due to heavy rain. Adrbara. So, many countries in the world are facing environmental issues, and Mongolia is not an exceptional nation anymore. We Mongolians have lived for centuries as nomads, maintaining an intimate relationship with water, land, and sky. Even today, many of our people continue to live in this traditional way. However, Mongolia is experiencing serious environmental problems, including climate change, water shortage, and air pollution. As Clyde explained in his presentation, Mongolia is an example of a country that has not contributed much much to the causes of climate change, and yet is facing a devastating impact. While global temperatures have risen by an average 0.7 degrees Celsius, the average temperature in Mongolia has risen by 2.1 degrees, almost 3 times more than the world average. As a result, desertification, pasture degradation, and melting permafrost are threatening nomadic pastoralism. In addition, these climate changes will also have a direct impact on water supplies and water shortage. Mongolia is considered one of the more water-scarce nations in the world. Approximately 80% of our water supply is located in the northern part of Mongolia. 2 major water stress areas in Mongolia. First, Ulaanbaatar, the capital city where 50% of the population lives, and second is Gobi region, where major mining operations are being developed. About 1.5 million people live in the capital of the Ulaanbaatar, out of a total population in Mongolia, 3 million. At the current rate of water consumption and urban development, the water needs of Ulaanbaatar will exceed the available groundwater supply within 50 to 20 years. Indeed, Member of Parliament Oyungur mentioned water supply and underground water pollution in very critical situation in Ulaanbaatar city. Also, air pollution is one of the major environmental issues in Mongolia, also especially in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. The recent survey shows that Ulaanbaatar is one of the most polluted cities in the world, and the particulate matter in some areas is almost 10 times higher than WHO standards. Distinguished guests, on behalf of the Consulate General Mongolia in San Francisco, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Institute of East Asian Studies, Alicia, for initiating this important conference. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to express my gratitude to Mrs. Oyungur, Member of Parliament, for her great support to improve current Mongolian environmental issues, including initiating waste management law. In closing, I wish the conference will bring significant result to find potential solutions and improve current environmental situation in Mongolia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Consul General Dierkes. Now we're going to move on to our last speaker for today and our keynote speaker, who is David Sneath from the University of Cambridge. David Sneath is the director of the Mongolia and Inter-Asia Studies Unit, as well as a reader at the University of Cambridge's Division of Social Anthropology. He is also a fellow of Corpus Christi College at Cambridge. His research interests are very broad. They include Inner and Central Asia, pastoralism, the environment, decollectivization, and post-socialist social transformations, political, culture, and economic institutions in Inter-Asia, and the anthropology of development. His latest research explores two main themes: the representations of steppe societies in social and historical studies, and the political economy and ecology of Mongolia and Inner Asia. He's also involved now in a project titled Pathways to Understanding the Changing Climate, Time and Place in Cultural Learning About the Environment, which brings together educators and anthropologists working on a wide range of locations in Inner Asia and also the United Kingdom to try to develop a new comparative approach to understanding perceptions of environmental change, very much in keeping with what we just heard from Dr. Goulden. He has countless publications. The list is way too long to go through, including two sole-authored monographs, The Headless State, Aristocratic Orders, Kinship Society, and Misrepresentations of Nomadic Inner Asia, which came out at Columbia in 2007, and Changing Inner Mongolia, Pastoral Mongolian Society and the Chinese State, Oxford 2000. Today, his topic is Mongolian Pastoralism and Sustainability, Socio-technical, System Analysis, and Rural Reform. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Sneed.
Okay. So I thought that what I'd try to do today was to try to provide a kind of just some more general remarks about the setting of the conference, the theme of deadly modernity, and also set it in context with a more historical and slightly longer time view of the relationship between one particular element of Mongolian life, and that is pastoralism, and the environment, and its environment. Try to introduce some of the work that's been going on in this area. So I'll start, though, with a few remarks, if you like, about the question of deadly modernity, the theme, if you like, for our conference. Well, of course, if by modernity we mean modernism, and since the advent of postmodernist cultural critique, we might agree that we can speak more easily of modernism as an ideological form than we can about modernity as a sort of epoch. We can certainly agree that Mongolia has experienced two waves of modernism. It's been a very modernist place for a long time, since the 20s, from the 20s right through to the 80s. The first wave of Mongolian modernism arrived, and then post-1990, a second wave. So the first wave, if you like, would be the high modernism, the Soviet-style modernism modeled on much of the technologically driven social engineering and development project of the Soviet Union. Between the 20s and the 50s in particular, the Mongolian state followed the Soviet example in constructing, well, a pretty modern state. But it was also quite a deadly form of modernism. Certainly if you were one of the many lamas, as we all know, the Buddhist monastic establishment was central to Mongolia for much of the 19th century, and by the early 20th century became a target as the serious rival to the new Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party-run regime. So certainly it was pretty deadly in terms of the characters we see here captured in some of the early photographs, some of the earliest colour photographs in the Albert Hahn collection. And since then, since in the last decades, we know a lot more about the consequences of that. We've found a lot of the bones in mass graves and so on. But we know Marshal Choibalsan, the architect of the new modernist and very muscular Mongolian People's Republic after the death of Sukhbata, the eponymous sort of hero of the revolution. Choibalsan himself mentions at least over 20,000 lamas were executed on his orders. Probably may well have been more than that executed too. So it was a deadly modernity, the first wave, but it was also a very highly productive one. It created an educational system, a healthcare system. It created an industrial and an agricultural sector, in mechanized, all those sectors. It created a kind of orderly urban lifestyle, which when I was first in Mongolia in 1990, it was still very much like that. That's a photo in the 80s, but it was very similar in the 90s. almost all of the elements that one might think of in terms of modernity were very clearly well established in state socialist period of Mongolian history. And yet we know that this was swept away in so many ways by the second wave, post-1990, what some might call neoliberal modernism, if we use Harvey's formulation of neoliberal to indicate an ideological formation, perhaps a less useful term to describe the actual political and economic form. But in any case, what has been called neoliberal, we could easily just call it market modernism, and that wave has transformed Mongolia again in so many different ways. The age of the market, Zachtzerlin-Wien, that got introduced in the 90s, was part of a profound economic crisis, the collapse of those state-run industries, very rapid rise in unemployment, a loss of the kind of orderly, stable social prospects of jobs for life and job security, and instead a decade in the 90s of people trying to cope, most people finding ways and strategies to cope in the deep economic crisis. It was an era, of course, of opportunity, so the new rich emerged rapidly in the 90s and in the early part of this century, and of course mining, as we're going to spend a lot of time tomorrow, and we have already broached the subject, but there's much more to be said about the importance of mining and its impact on the environment. But mining and many other sectors allowed for the production of very super rich, and yet an awful lot of people throughout the 90s and even, I'm afraid, into the 21st century, widespread precarity, people living in precarious ways. The well-known example might be the so-called ninja gold mining boom, which is pretty much over. But certainly in the 90s and the early noughties was one of the many ways that people needed to try to make ends meet. So we're familiar then with this second market modernism that swept through Mongolia. But was it very deadly? Well, if you weren't a human, if you were an animal, then it was pretty deadly for millions of livestock. Mongolia really sort of hit the international headlines right at the turn of the century. So the first of these dzods, the very severe winter climatic conditions which led to the death of millions of livestock, got well known, was well seen in the West internationally at the turn of the 20th to the 21st century. So 6 million, for example, livestock lost in these in 2 or 3 bad winters when we had successive dzods. It was rather an exaggeration in this British national newspaper to say that Mongolia was starving. It really kind of wasn't, but it was very tough times. And of course, it meant the end of the livelihood for very many Mongolian pastoralists. And this has become a periodic crisis. It's a chronic problem now. Mongolian livestock sector is expecting the next dzod, is facing a dzod, a growing dzod. Every few years, another dzod, one of these very severe winter livestock disasters emerges and unfolds. Of course, other problems have also emerged. We've heard about the widespread concerns over pastoral degradation and overgrazing, and we'll look a bit more in a minute as to for the root causes of that change. But basically, we might then take a step back and sort of look at the picture that emerges from the second wave, if you like, of modernism, and see that at least when we turn to rural lifestyles, we can see a livestock sector that's very vulnerable to climatic variability and vulnerable to pastoral degradation. Well, why is this? Why is this emerging now? Has something important changed as a result of this more recent modernization? Well, the environments are pretty much the same. If you divide it roughly into that tripartite zoning, which you can, the Hangai zone, the mountain zone is pretty much as it was. The steppe doesn't look so different from the 80s and early 90s when that photo was taken, or indeed the desert and semi-desert, the Gov, pretty much the same. The livestock, have they changed? Well, in some ways. The bogmal, that is the small livestock of sheep and goats, many more goats, Yuma, than there used to be. So livestock numbers have increased dramatically. We'll look at that in a minute. But the types, well, there's been a loss of many of the specialist breeds that were developed in the state socialist period, where special breeds were developed, and many of those were lost, although National Genetic Fund managed to salvage some of them. But much of the bulk of the livestock population for these small animals is pretty similar. The Uhur cattle and Temer, the camels, well, have they changed? Well, I'm afraid the camel numbers have always been small, and they're still kind of sinking gradually, despite campaigns to revive them. But in other ways, even the most famous, the iconic livestock animal of Mongolia, the horse, Bator, still milked for egg now as it was before. So some changes, even, mustn't forget the Sarlig, the yak that we saw on Clyde's photos too. So all these features look familiar. So what else might have changed? Well, the forms of mobile housing, the GIRD, that allows people to move their residences so as to make use of different microclimates and different pastures in different times throughout the pastoral cycle. That's been retained, a flexible residence, the Aeth, which is, can be a group of GIRDs, or even a tent, a märchen here, has been retained. New technologies such as solar power panels allow for light in the evenings in a way that wasn't possible before. So pastoral skills and techniques, well, still plenty of the use of the org, pole, the Sioux, and all the skills and knowledges needed to herd livestock on the steppes still exist. There's a lot more of this, of the motorcycle herding in the last decade or so than in the past, but all of these things are still recognizable. So what is the problem? Is it just that mobile pastoralism is simply a low technology kind of subsistence economy? It's an ancient way of life, and it's now outstripping its resource base because of kind of population pressure or something like that. Is it something like that? It's basically a primitive kind of way of living. Well, I hope to explain, I'm sure many of you in the room will already anticipate that I'll try to show no, it's not, and let's see why. Can we learn something from the past? These problems, at least as they present themselves to us, but not so new in some ways, but as they present themselves to us, many of them appear to be sort of new problems. And if we look back to the most immediate historical era before, in the collective era of the state socialism, the pastoral sector was vastly more productive. It was also less vulnerable to climatic variation as far as the individual herding household was concerned. Although there were plenty of harsh winters, dzods, all through that period, as we'll see, it had a very different kind of impact on people's livelihoods. Now, the Mongolian pastoral collectives, NGOs, and state farms, Sanganajahwai, were basically dotted throughout the country within the Sum districts, so that in some cases they were even hyphenated. Sumnugdal could even be a single kind of term to indicate this combined entity, which was an agricultural, i.e. livestock breeding, or agricultural as in crop raising institution throughout rural Mongolia. The way in which these institutions operated involved the central management of land. So as Oyungurl mentioned, of course, this is a public form. So in that sense, this is a public form of ownership. So sort of notionally, the state owns all the land, and it's parceled out to the individual Nugdal or Sanganajahwai, the collective farm involved or state farm involved. And it was managed as a block of land, with a central management structure by the management of the farm. The management had mechanized support to draw upon. It had pools of trucks and so on, so that it could move pastoralists to the different pastures in the different seasons. So this particular one happens to be of a state farm, Sumber Sanganajahwai, which is a state farm in what's now Gov Sumber Emig, used to be Dorn Gov Emig, where I worked for 6 months in the 90s, and it was still operating. It hadn't quite collapsed. It was on the verge of collapse, but it still got a very good sense of what the old state farm structure was like in operation in '93 when I was there. And critically, fodder was supplied. The hadlung, that is the areas of grazing land, of hay-making pasture, would be harvested by the tractors that the collective farms operated, and could be parcelled out and delivered to the CIRDI, which was the name for the particular herding encampments, which we could also call ale, for their to overwinter them so that the livestock that they were allocated by the collective management would be sustained through the winter months. Now, what happened? Well, that old structure was quite inimical to the new wave of modernism, because, of course, in neoliberal or market modernist thought, the economy ought to be composed of private property and the market to attain its maximum efficiency. The neoclassical or marginalist economic doctrines call for private property, which allows for an undisputed, clear relationship between a legal person, which of course could be a company, and a resource. And with this clarity would allow investment, and a free market, the freer the better, would allow for the optimum allocation of resources to labour and other inputs, so as to create the most efficient economy. And this was indeed applied to Mongolia, as we all know, so that in 91 the collective and state farms were disbanded. With decollectivisation meant that the livestock and the other assets of those state farms and collective farms were divided between the households. So many households received livestock as private property. But lots of other households also received them, because this coincided with the collapse of many of the state-run industries. So in order to mop up the expanding number of unemployed people, many people received livestock through some connection, through kin or some other connection with state collective farms. So the numbers who relied on pastoralism nearly triples at this time as the other employment opportunities collapse. And this new livestock sector that emerges from this reform is atomized into thousands of small household units with variable and limited resources. Some of them did very well. Some people came out of it with very good herds of livestock, valuable livestock and so on, and others penny packets in a position without necessarily good access to other resources, key resources, for example. So the central facilities that had managed these larger grazing schemes collapsed. So this was a typical kind of collective farm building that just became derelict, and the mechanised transport broke down at this time, or they either broke down literally because spare parts were supplied by the Soviet Union, and as Alicia mentioned, when the World Bank economists got into Mongolia in the early 90s, they went through the books and they decided that about 30% of the GDP of Mongolia was in effect supplied by the Soviet Union, a lot of it through very cheap fuel oil and other notional subsidies. But at the time, of course, the internal pricing mechanisms of Comecon, the state socialist trading bloc, meant that these subsidies weren't quite as apparent. In any case, the spare parts dried up. A series of other opportunities emerged for using transportation. Commercial trading operations diverted a lot of trucks. So a lot of these trucks in the 90s ended up sitting unused, rusting and falling apart, whereas before they'd been used to move pastoralists as part of a collective motor pool. The result was that a lot of the poorer households really lacked any kind of mechanised transport, and of course the fodder supplies also dried up. There was a decline in coordinated movement, those big systems which allowed the managers to park so many households on the Doslung, on the summer pastures for so many weeks, and then move them all cleanly off to the autumn pastures and then onto winter pastures at different times in the agricultural seasons. That coordination collapsed. In many cases, the longer movements also declined. And critically, of course, to Jerth, the winter fodder also was no longer supplied, and people had to try and cut their own. That's a lot easier in the Hangai than it is down in the steppe and the Gobi. Up in the Hangai, lots of places they might have hadlung that is, areas where the steppe grass grows long enough for you to cut by hand. Often a lot of this hay cutting for much of the 90s, and even still now, a good deal of it done by hand with sickle. Increasingly, of course, some mechanisation slowly returned. So more and more got to be cut by machine. But perhaps most critically, certainly if we're thinking about pastoral degradation, perhaps most critically, the livestock numbers absolutely soared. So if around here, around 1990, around here, they begin to rise, in fact, because these are 5-yearly data points, they mask the very rapid fluctuations up and down, these big swings caused by booms and then zods, which cut the numbers back down again. So actually, it was up as far as 44 million at one point, and then dropped down into about 30 million as a result of zods in the early periods. And now, as many of you will know, the total number of livestock have reached an unprecedented level, estimated over 55 million livestock at the end of 2015. Who knows what the last few weeks and months of pretty harsh weather in Mongolia may have done to that number, may have knocked it down a bit. But you can also see, very interestingly, that the number of goats has gone up. Sheep and goats are very important for lots of different reasons. They're the single biggest contributor to this total number. That total isn't quite as bad as it looks because the smaller numbers of the larger livestock have not increased as much. So if we converted these into the standard stocking units of sheep units, the increase wouldn't be quite so dramatic. But it's still a very, very large number of livestock. Now, one of the things that we notice from this graph is that during the period of the state farms and collectives, the total number of livestock remains pretty constant between 20 and 25 million. So in comparison, the latest era, since the 90s really, has been a very dramatic increase. We've only seen a similar dramatic increase with the collapse of the previous regime, but we'll go into that in a minute. But anyway, it means that why are there so many livestock on the steppes? Well, one of the things that has happened, of course, is that the number of livestock being slaughtered, what we call the offtake from those herds, has declined. So rather than seeing that very high number of livestock as meaning a much higher productive base, actually a lot of that livestock wealth is simply accumulating as wealth. It's not necessarily being extracted. This, I'm afraid, stops in 2007, and I couldn't easily update it. But you'll get the sense, anyway, that since the collective era, the amount of offtake has declined somewhat. In fact, latest meat figures are clawing back up to something like these old levels. But in any case, the live export of animals has also declined. But as a percentage, of course, it's far lower, because birthing rates, the way in which you measure the, if you like, productivity of a pastoral sector involves the birthing rates, the number of live births, and the amount that one can extract in terms of sold meat and livestock products. And all of those things fell very dramatically in the 90s in the new atomized pastoral sector that emerged. So how can we explain these changes? Did Mongolians somehow simply forget how to make this household pastoralism work sustainably? If the older system, if the collective system was operated at a very large unit, which of course had an important relationship with the household one, but nevertheless retained control and management of land at the big level and retained ownership of most of the livestock at that big level and retained and utilized machinery and other important resources at the large collective level. Of course, it had a relationship with the household, but many of the important elements were at the large scale. What happened? Did Mongolians somehow forget how to make the smaller, humble, pastoral household economy work sustainably? Did the collective era perhaps destroy some sort of traditional or community-based pastoralism that came before it? Well, I think the answer really is no. And the reason is, if you have a good look at what there was before, pre-revolutionary pastoralism, apart from a short period, a few decades after the collapse of the neo-feudal period and before the introduction of the collectives, for the bulk of certainly the 19th and indeed 18th century, and stretching right back actually even earlier, we can call it something like a neo-feudal social order within which pastoralism operated. So this guy is a senior lama from that era, from again, one of the Albert Khan photographs. And someone like him was at the top of a pyramid that was pretty starkly divided. The rich, you can see these rich noble women in their very expensive costumes, and the humble Albert or Sommenart, who are the subjects, who did almost all of the agricultural and pastoral labour. She was photographed because of the remarkable smoking child she had by a passing Westerner. So basically, in that period, then the land was divided into other large units, not collective farms, but into princely appanages, which could also be run by a monastery. Monastic estates or princely appanages then, the hosho, as they were termed at the time, translated often as banners. And now huge numbers of livestock were owned by both the secular elite and by religious institutions. The monasteries, which had jath, which was the term for these monastic estates of livestock. And they were herded for them by subjects who were tied to the hosho. You could not leave the hosho if you were a subject of that status. You needed permission to move out. So you stayed and you did the work assigned to you. Now, these hoshos were almost like little miniature political economies. They controlled their own livestock and they controlled labour, and most important, perhaps, they controlled land, okay, the access to land. And they supported large-scale, complex herding systems. So this one, for example, is the reconstruction of the herding system in Lamin Gegern Hosho, which was a banner in what is now Bayan Hongaramag. And we're very lucky because there was a brilliant Russian geographer called Simakov who visited the area and actually lived there and got to know the place very well indeed, Simakov, and he also made detailed notes and accounts of what was left by way of the monastic operation. And this Lamin Gegern Hosho was thought of as a model, a particularly efficient model monastic estate. And there's no point in trying to decipher the complexities of these little diagrams, the triangles and so on. Basically, there's a different types of livestock herded by subjects designated to herd these types of livestock to these different pastures at different times. It was basically a large and complicated system. It was coordinated from the centre. The people had to supply an amount of produce to the monastery each year. In fact, in many ways, these things are not so very different from the collective and state farms that eventually replaced them. They were obviously entirely different ideologically, but in terms of a large-scale institution that managed land and livestock, allocated labour, not so different. Now, we've got good reason to believe, as Clyde mentioned, we've got good reason to believe that high mobility is a good strategy to adopt when you have highly variable climatic conditions. So, for example, this is a map done in the 90s, which shows not rainfall, but variability of rainfall. So these yellow areas are the most variable amounts of rainfall, and then the blue and dark regions are the most least variable and most regular amounts of rainfall. And the argument goes that in certain conditions, in conditions of non-equilibrium, which I hope to show you a slide of in a minute. Yeah. Now, the non-equilibrial theory for rangeland systems, which is work that was originally done in Africa in the 80s, suggested that where you have areas where the amount of rainfall and therefore the amount of fodder available for animals varies enormously because you can have a lot of rain, you'll get a lot of fodder, but if you don't have rain, you won't. Because that variability is so high, you can't actually create a meaningful average. It means that that the notion of a standard carrying capacity, so you could have 1,000 animals on this amount of land, is actually a meaningless concept. You can have 1,000 animals, provided they can move around and find the places, go to the places where you do have the fodder available. So carrying capacity then becomes a much less important matter than having flexible access to large areas of land. And so this map of the variability of rainfall, what we did is we mapped on top not the current boundaries, but the old pre-revolutionary Hessl boundaries, which were the areas within which movement was supposed to take place, was authorized to take place. And the largest of these units tend to be in the areas with the greatest amount of variability, suggesting, as if we needed proof, that these system-building elites, those in charge of the old pastoral systems in their estates in the past, understood very well that mobility was important, and the more variable the climate and available pasture, the more flexible movement one needed. Now, the other thing about systems of mobile land use is that they do appear to be more sustainable than static intensification. So for a long time, you could see from space the difference between the static exploitation. This is on the northern border with the Buryat area, where there were a lot of static farms, and on that side of the border, a lot of the ground, you can see the loss of topsoil and the loss of ground cover. This is the Mongolian side of the border. You can see the Mongolian border running very clearly along there, and there too. And these were areas that were grazed in much more mobile systems. Of course, there's nothing random about the grazing. These are carefully organized. And of course, until the 90s, they were planned movements by collective and state farm administrations. Okay, so why did, if you like, this second wave, this market modernization, have such a large impact upon pastoralism? After all, pastoralists still had all those same skills, they still inhabited the same environment, and so on. Well, I think one way that, at least for me, it became helpful to think about understanding these changes was in terms of socio-technical systems. Now, that's a term used by Pfaffenberger to describe the linkage of techniques and material culture to the social coordination of labour. So Pfaffenberger did his study actually in Sri Lanka. This is an area where, before British colonial rule, there was a system of village water supply which created a fantastically productive agricultural sector. So the Sri Lankan agriculture relied upon a very complicated set of overlapping rights to the land and obligations upon villagers to supply labour to keep the irrigation canals open and to supply them with water. Now, the British colonial administration arrived and decided in a similar, if you like, with a notion of modernisation which also thought that unambiguous ownership, outright private ownership, must be a far superior form, introduced private ownership of the lands. And it broke up any sort of multiple rights and claims to the lands. The problem with that was it collapsed. That new ownership pattern collapsed the old system, which relied upon a very complicated set of coordination between different parties and different obligations. And the result actually was a far less productive and sophisticated farming system. Now, we can very easily recognize Pfaffenberger's point here, that here we had a socio-technical system. The technology was integrated and required the social coordination of labour for it to operate. Well, this, I think, is exactly true for the Mongolian pastoral sector too. It is equally sophisticated and complex. So it helped me, anyway, to try and make sense of this by thinking about property regimes and socio-technical systems in conjunction. That is, the linkage of techniques and material culture to the social coordination of labour, which we have with a socio-technical system notion, indicates that we can't easily isolate technology from its social setting, and that productive systems rely upon a whole set of social relations. They rely upon rights and obligations. They rely upon political orders. And they, of course, also rely on the technical knowledge of those concerned. So if you like, we could see that we could think about a citizenship regime which in any given historical era or epoch indicates and controls and influences and shapes the social coordination of labour, depending on whether it's if the citizenship regime was one of slavery or serfdom, certain kinds of labour coordination is possible. We have property regimes which govern, if you like, the access to resources. Put together, putting citizenship regimes and property regimes together, we get something like old-fashioned political economy, if you like. So within that perspective, then, I think it makes, for me anyway, it became clearer to see what had happened. So in the collective period, then, property was in terms of large units with central ownership, and it centralized the risk of, say, damage from variable climate, bad conditions, and so on. And it assigned workers. Of course, there were much more freedom than in the neo-feudal times, far more upward mobility, lots of routes out of collective farms into other sectors. But nevertheless, the different herding brigades were allocated to different places. Now, in the post-collective period, we've got a different unit, a smaller, the household unit, with private ownership. And the liability, the risk, lies with the household, not with a bigger unit. And of course, we have a labour market, albeit one in which there's very large underemployment and therefore not so many options for people. The result was that alongside the distribution of all those livestock and as private property, risk was also distributed. Since mobile pastoralism can be seen as part of a larger socio-political system, it was part of that system that as that larger, wider order collapsed, both the value and the viability of pastoralism naturally changed. And along with the property rights to livestock, as they were distributed to citizens, came the risks of the environment and so on. Because in the old system, if a Zod struck a particular collective farm, it wouldn't mean the loss of any particular person's livelihood. Almost all the animals that might be lost actually belonged to the collective farm, and they would be restocked from other collective farms as part of this broader, wider national economy. So, however, in the new arrangement, since they were no longer underwritten by the larger system, then when household livelihoods could be destroyed by harsh weather, there was really no other option for people to move out of pastoralism or borrow money to try and restock their herds. Now, if we look into the future, the sorts of environmental change that Clyde described, then this is one of the many models. It's the Hadley Centre, the British Hadley Centre, that creates models for for changing climate from, in this case, 2070 to 2100. And if this zone here is the Mongolian plateau, if you expand it, you can see that some of the highest levels of predicted change are over Mongolia. But they change in both directions. They're also both high and low. Indeed, if you compare the different models that are making predictions about different things from rainfall to average temperatures, wind speed, and so on, the one thing they all share is greater variability. So it looks as if, at least if these models are right, that the Mongolian pastoral sector of the future is going to face increased variability. And I think that makes us aware of some choices and some questions. Can a sort of household-based livestock sector be productive and sustainable given that climatic variation may well, almost certainly is, frankly, going to increase? And so the question that I find most interesting then is what scale and type of institutions are best suited to Mongolia's circumstances and best able to respond to variability, both environmental and climatic, and indeed economic variability, since increasingly now Mongolian pastoral livelihoods are related directly to international market prices, both for cashmere and other key products, but also actually credit, because most Mongolian households are now in debt to some degree. So if interest rates increase, and they're already pretty high in Mongolia, about as high actually as they were in the pre-revolutionary period, when many historians feel that one of the major ingredients in the independence movement, the revolution that split Mongolia from China, was the very high levels of interest that the Chinese merchants charged on loans, and they're about as high, 3% a month, as they are now. The international money markets are another risk that Mongolian pastoralists are subject to. They're subject to the risk of environment, to the risk of prices for their primary products and also for the risks over the interest they're going to pay on loans. So under those conditions, what kind of institutions and what scale of institutions will best insulate individual Mongolian pastoralists from these risks of the future? Now, I don't have an answer, but I think those are some of the questions we might ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sneath. That was really, really fascinating. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, so I'd like to invite our panelists and David Sneath to take seats up here at the table and throw it open to the audience. There are hands up already, so you better move. Okay, I think in the back was first.
Yeah, my question is...
We're going to give you a microphone.
Yeah, it's all bigger for it.
Awesome. Can you hear me, everyone? Great. My name's George James. I'm an MBA student here at the Haas School of Business. Prior experiences, I'm from Wyoming. We have a similar kind of climate, oil and gas background, actually. So I was really interested to hear some of the things that you guys were talking about. And it seems like you guys did a very great job at defining that there's lots of problems going on in Mongolia, especially environmental problems. Curious a little bit, and this is probably specifically towards Alicia, I think, or Alicia, you and you. What are some of the solutions you would say to, people still need energy, still want to do coal, even though coal burning is bad for them, they're still going to do it. So what is the solution rather than just talking about the problem?
Is this on? It looks like it's on, but is anything happening? Yes. Thank you. That's basically the way I look at the world is life is full of questions, and it's good because that keeps us interested. But the bottom line is we have to survive, and results are the key. For example, I can tell you one of the answers to the question that Dr. Sneath said was the Mongolians came up with themselves in the 90s and the 2000s of insurance for herders. Now, how successful the individual insurance on herders as a policy has worked over the past 10 years or so, I don't know because I haven't followed it. But I was very interested when the insurance industry in Mongolia came up with this concept, which of course is very unique and responds to Mongolia's own situation. As far as the development criteria, life is full of choices, and a lot of times the choices are all bad, and you have to pick the least bad choice. That's what the Mongolian voters, time after time, have to decide. Do we want to keep a lifestyle that in many cases 1/2 of the population of Mongolia only reads about and teaches to their children when they read stories at night, but don't actually have to be out in the zood with the herds? We all know of that Mongolia has been grappling with the creation of 2 different societies in the democratic era, one which is urban and sedentary and much more technologically connected to the globalized world, and then the other society, increasingly rural. The rural population in Mongolia in 1989 is 28%. At the end of the 90s, because of the unemployment and the collapse of the socialist system, it had gone over 45%. And that's what Mongolia should have done because it fed itself. And I was there in the 90s when everything collapsed, but at least the people in the countryside had the meat because of the privatization of the herds, and they fed and gave milk to the people in the city. And so they survived those terrible 1990s. But we do have the society somewhat growing apart. But what I was trying to show is even on the idea of environment and pollution, you have different problems depending on which part of the society you're in. And so when you go and talk to the urban voter, who represents 1/2 of the people of Mongolia now, voting in elections, and you want to talk to them about environmental problems and grazing, water, and water problems down in the South Gobi, what is their reaction to those kinds of things when, if you limit the infrastructure building and the mining, you're going to immediately hit those people's pockets? They're the ones who are sitting in Ulan Bator in the government ministries and the NGOs and in the research think tanks who are feeding and becoming middle-class people because of this mining. So then think about it from the rural point of view. When Mongolia is talking about a law to limit the ninja miners and the gold mining, when we stopped the licenses for 5 years, new licenses, the majority of the licenses taken back by the water and the forest protection laws were gold mining licenses because they were very individualistic, often Mongols, particularly high percentage of Chinese. And the way they were mining was polluting the waters around the most fertile grasslands and into the cities in the Tool River, which impacts on Mongolia. So now when you worry about that situation and air pollution, what's the reaction of the herders down in the Gobi who say, oh yeah, those people in the city, they're worried about, sewage, they're worried about air pollution, but why they chose to live there in that sedentary lifestyle. We're out here living the Mongolian natural way. So again, we're having different pressures on the parliamentary representatives, such as Mrs. Oyungerel, to represent her people in the parliament. In the Mongolian parliament, the countryside voters not only have the best voting record, they also have a disproportionately high percentage of seats in the parliament, so that their voice is, and it should be, certainly strongly represented. But if you want one man, one vote, and you're sitting in Ulaanbaatar, you don't necessarily have that same point of view, because the people in the countryside and their attitudes about mining, which are actually what fueling Mongolia's development, are because they're bringing in the revenues or they're attracting the foreign direct investment. Those kind of things, and the stop and go legislation, which so disturbs the foreign investors, are directly a result of democracy in Mongolia, asking the representatives of the people in the countryside to go to the parliament and represent them and their interests as the nation makes national policy. And so in this situation, the Mongolians have a lot of different pressures on them. And I always said to the American officials who complain about Mongolia's mining policies and as being very changeable, changeable. I say, this is a democracy. This is what we said we wanted. And the people in the countryside are pressuring, as they should, their representatives to represent them in the central government seat of power in the capital. And a lot of this are policies and ideas that have come from outsiders, many of them good-hearted and some of them maybe perhaps not, and convince the Mongolian government to implement certain policies. And they have very uneven effects on the society. And so because they have uneven effects, you have a very discontented Mongolian citizenry. But I was in Mongolia in 1975, and I was in Mongolia in 1990. There was almost no change between 1975 and 1990. I've gone to Mongolia 40 times since 1990, and we all know every 2-3 months Mongolia changes. Are all the changes good? No, but most of them are, because Mongolia in 2016 is not the Mongolia of 1990. And I think that for, at least in terms of the society, the general trend is for the better. but there are still major problems that they have to work on.
Thank
I
you.
think the question was directed to
I would
Oya
like
Girl, too.
I would like to add a few, just answer to the student's question. So when we have this dilemma, whether we should continue mining or not, there are several answers, at least for now. For example, in our parliament, during these 4 years I'm sitting in the parliament, we have been voting back and forth, for example, on two mining very frequently. One was Oyutolga. Of course, majority of the parliament members want to move Oyutolga as fast as possible because Oyutolga is not coal. It's a gold and copper, and we want money and we want revenue. So we want to move it ahead. So Oyutolga had actually good political support, but there is a procedural things, how they sign their papers, where they sign their papers become politics. Like, for example, latest memorandum of understanding was signed in Dubai, and suddenly it became a politics because why Prime Minister had to sign this paper in a foreign land while why he had to hide things from Mongolian people, etc. So procedural things are causing lots of debates. But in general, there is almost a consensus in every party except one or two small parties. There is a widespread consensus that we should move Oyutolga as fast as possible because that will bring us a revenue that will pay our debts. So another mining project we've been working back and forth was Sinterra Gold project, also gold mining project in Noyungol. So that mountain happened to have, from the mining distance, like 20-something kilometers from, no, 18 kilometers from mining location, we happen to have a World Heritage kind of site, Hunnu. It's like 2,000 years ago, yeah? So it's a Hunnu tombs, which is a very deep tombs, very particular. And Hunnu Empire is very well known in Mongolia. It's like a founding empire on Mongolian land 1,200 years ago before Genghis Khan. So it's the empire that caused a great China Wall. So that the concentration of that finding, archaeological finding, caused lots of controversy whether we should move that project back along. Actually, we voted yes. After many, many debates and many going back and forth, we voted yes, we should move this project only because the gold deposit of that project goes deep down to 200 meters down, maybe till the center of the earth it goes down. But only the economic possibility to mine is until 2,000 meter deep. 200 meter deep. So we would like to mine that gold because we need that money. So that's why we voted yes. But we couldn't vote on Tauntolga. We couldn't vote on any coal projects and any phosphate mining projects. I personally am opposing widespread land scrapping, especially on strip mining, just because the bigger the land stripping happening, the bigger the impact is giving to the communities, herders and the environment and the water and all kinds of things. So that's why the projects that is digging deeper down, just mechanically speaking, deeper down, is moving. The projects that's stripping to the wider area are now very cautious. We are freezing it with the local demands, with the environmentalist movements, and also thanks to this Paris Agreement lately, all coal projects are freezing down itself, which is a blessing for environmental concerns. But at the same time, there are so many licenses that are coal mine licenses. We are now having a very strong dilemma what to do with these licenses. State already gave it away, but businesses spend their money, but coal is not profitable because it's too cheap. So we want coal price never go up. So only that will be the good solution. But if coal price goes up, if world market drives Mongolia to wrong direction again, then the Gobi, half of the hunger will be very much in danger environmentally. So that's another thing. The other thing is that there are two kinds of coals that we are talking about. Coking coal of town tolga is not the coal that we are burning for our stoves. That's why when we talk about exporting coal, we talk about coking coal. But when we talk about using coal as a fuel, that we are talking about very high sulfur bad coal that we are mining nearby our Ulaanbaatar city. At that coal, we are going to have a strong attack, not for not mining, but for not using. Because government is government is doing homework to prepare a paper for parliament to bring up the new plan on changing the heating systems of Gir district. Parliament recently, when we were discussing about reviewing of Sustainable Development Plan goals and Paris Agreement at the Parliament, we set a 4-year term as a policy to eliminate coal-based heating in Gir district of Ulaanbaatar. So if you want to live in Ulaanbaatar in a Gir district, we have to switch your heating into a different system, and that should be invested. So we should invest now into startup companies who are doing progressive heating on renewable energy or on electric heating or whatever, but which is not based on coal for Gir district. But for power plants, we cannot say so at now, because for our generation of electricity, we still will need coal for a while. So for that, we will probably start talking about air pollution control and using more and more air pollution control in power plants so that we can have cleaner smoke at least from the power plants, but we don't want to have low-rise smoke because every family has, as I told in my paper, only 4 meter tall pipes from which the thick sulfur and the nitrogen-rich, very dirty pollution comes. So that's what we're trying to do. So we are going to go new investment to startup companies that will bring new heating systems to Mongolians. And only Mongolian engineers are working on it very extensively, and lots of initiatives there, and cabinet need to pick which kind of proposals will be scaled up and supported. Another thing, I just wanted to mention just one thing to the David Smith's report. It was very interesting to see the comparison between our pastoralism in different eras. But one thing I know as economist on a planning economy, because I did my planning economy degree during Soviet Union, and I was actually supposed to be a good planning economist. But then after I graduated, we became a market economy country, and then I studied in Russia again on market economy. So then I studied in Stanford University on international policy studies. So I happen to know, I worked during planning economy exactly on helping the cooperatives to manage the meat export and purchasing the technical exports, etc. So what happened during that time, why the number of animals, the livestock was so steady, like around 25 million, was because every year we exported to Russia about 10 million livestock, out of which maybe 8 million is just herd animal alive. But after Russia and Mongolia cut their trade relationships, after Mongolia chose democracy 2 years before Russia, we actually was cut in one day. All trade relationships, all contracts were annulled, and also our budget was cut, of course, and then we had deep economic crisis. Actually, that time, we were just left alone to survive, and actually we survived. And then, because of that, we still couldn't restore that export channel again. So because we didn't restore our big meat export channel, our meat is now accumulating, eating the pasture. So one Dr. Bakke, who is actually a member of parliament, recently released his doctoral paper, and I happened to read that, and he calculated that in order to bring back to the sustainable level of livestock, every year we should slaughter at least 13 million, and out of which we should export at least half, and use the half on the domestic market in order to go to the sustainable level of pasture management. And he had a very, very precise diagrams of every pasture areas, so that which animal can sustain how many animals, etc. So he had a very good maps on that. But what I learned from that report was that we are now not using meat production, not exporting meat. That's why government cabinet, this cabinet is actually being very aggressive, trying to find channels to export Mongolia's meat. And each time we make big contract, it becomes annulled because of some kind of animal disease outbreak comes in Mongolia. So we had to control this area and then control that area, etc. So government is now trying to set up a free zone where all animals can be brought and then vaccinated or quarantined and then slaughtered. Then all meat can be analyzed and then exported in large numbers. So that might work, but it still has a political risk, because the area that was designated for free zone for agricultural export was former Halkhingol area, which is current Halkhingol area, which is a former war field between Japan and Mongolia in 1939. So the political question is now, are we going to give this big land as a free zone to any foreigner or anyone to use, while our fathers and grandfathers defended that land with their blood? So lots of things happening around this political time. But so if we still go back from that model, then we will still have to look for another way how to increase Mongolia's meat export so that we can have sustainable number of livestock.
And if I can just add one more thing. Okay, you have all of that is true. That's the whole situation. Then add this layer. Mongolia's economy is 90% controlled by trade, import, export with China. China could buy all Mongolia's meat and animal byproducts. But is that the best thing for Mongolia to do? And make the situation that is very bad and dangerous for any country. It doesn't make any difference that it's China. If it were 90% Russia, it would also be bad. If it's 90% Japan, it's bad. So they need to find other customers. Why can't they find other customers? Because there's no infrastructure, transport connectivity. It's a landlocked country. There are countries that would buy Mongolian meat in the Middle East, in Turkey, even maybe in Japan, if we can get over the health problems. But you've got to get the product to the market. And that means you either go through China, overused and overcapacity railroads, or through the Trans-Siberian, which is actually falling apart. 70% of it is over 100 years old. The railings on the ground are 100 years old. So these are the realities that Mongolia works with. Yes, we want to diversify the economy, but how do you do it? And to build the infrastructure, to add the rails and the highways costs money. Where do you get the money? How do you convince investors to come in and get the money? You have to make deals that are not very attractive and have to be carefully explained to the Mongolian people who don't understand why the foreigners are getting such a good deal.
That
That's
was a
the reality.
excuse me, that was a very productive question, I have to say. But I think we're completely, unfortunately, out of time for our question and answer session. And we have a reception, so I encourage you to ask questions one-on-one as for the next little bit of time that we still have left in this room. Thank you all so very much. That was really wonderful.